This passage and accompanying graph are adapted from what history says about inequality and technology. As more of the economy becomes automated, doomsayers worry that the gap between the haves and the have nots will only grow. History shows, however, that this need not be so. The recent rise in earnings for skilled workers is a rare historical phenomenon, compiling records from churches, monasteries, colleges, guilds, and governments. Gregory Clark, an economist at the University of California, Davis, has put together a comprehensive data set of English wages that stretches back to the 13th century. Mr. Clark notes that in the past, the skilled wage premium, defined as the difference in wages, expressed as a ratio between craftsmen, such as carpenters and masons, and unskilled laborers, has been fairly stable, save for two sharp declines. The first drop came in the 14th century and had nothing to do with technological change. Life expectancy in medieval England was short and interest rates were high, meaning that taking on the 7-year apprenticeship needed to become a craftsman came with a heavy opportunity cost. But interest rates started falling in this period from around 10% in 1290 to 7.5% in 1340. When the Black Death struck England in 1348, wiping out a third of the population, interest rates fell further to 5% and apprenticeships became much more attractive. The increased supply of skilled labor relative to unskilled workers drove down the wage premium. Data from Jan Leighton van Zanten of Utrecht University shows similar patterns in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. The second big decline in the skilled wage premium came after the Industrial Revolution. Inventions like the power loom displaced artisans and increased the relative demand for unskilled labor. Craftsmen whose skills took years to hone suddenly found themselves being replaced by machines operated by workers with just a few months' training. The Luddites reacted by smashing the machines. One study has found that the share of unskilled workers rose from 20% of the labor force in 1700 to 39% in 1850. The ratio of craftsmen's wages to laborers started to fall in the early 1800s and did not recover until 1960. Using a different inequality measure leads to slightly different results. Peter Lindert, also at the University of California, Davis, says that as middle skilled jobs in England disappeared, the Gini coefficient of household earnings rose, peaking in 1800. The share of earnings captured by the top 1% reached a high in around 1870, but the two measures then went on to fall, not bottoming out until the mid 20th century. What distinguishes the advances of the computer age from those on the Industrial Revolution is that they have favored skilled workers. So far, university degrees have been a reliable proxy for skill, but this may change as artificial intelligence starts taking jobs away from white collar workers. Projections from America's Bureau of Labor Statistics show that 4 of the 5 fastest growing occupations in the country involve personal care. None of those jobs require a bachelor's degree. In any case, to assume that current economic trends will persist is to assume an inefficient labor market. Ken Rogoff, an economist at Harvard, argues that as the wage premium for a particular group of workers rises, firms will have a greater incentive to replace them. Okay, and then we have this graph. Over the course of the passage, the main focus shifts from a criticism of current methods of measuring income inequality to a suggestion for a better approach, a discussion of historical trends in income inequality to an analysis of more recent ones, an overview of patterns in income equality to an inquiry into the causes of this inequality, an analysis of the skilled wage premium to a critique of other related measures. So I think this would be between B and C, so we can strike out A and D. You can cancel D because there is an analysis of the skilled wage premium, but there is no critique of other related measures of measuring income inequality. There is no criticism of methods of measuring income inequality, The only thing that the passage presents is trends. So if you go back and look at the beginning of the passage, it starts by talking about the trends and says that the rise in earnings for skilled workers is a rare historical phenomenon. And then he presents the findings of Gregory Clark, who says that the wage premium for craftsmen with respect to unskilled labor has been fairly stable, except for two sharp declines. And then those declines are brought out. And then towards the end, we are basically looking at the current situation, right? What's happening today with the skilled versus unskilled wage gap and how artificial intelligence might change that, right? So I think B is a good answer. So I am leaning towards B. Option C says an overview of patterns in income equality to an inquiry into the causes of this inequality. So I don't think that the inquiry is into the causes of this inequality broadly, right? The only part where an inquiry is done is when the skilled wages fell precipitously with regard to unskilled wages, right? One of which happened here when interest rates started to fall, right? And there was a surplus of skilled workers. And the other was after the Industrial Revolution, right? So this is about the fall in skilled wages. It doesn't really look at the causes of this inequality as on these two particular cases when this inequality between skilled laborers and unskilled laborers happened. So B is a better answer. In the context of the passage as a whole, the phrase doomsayer's worry serves mainly to, so this comes here. As more of the economy becomes automated, doomsayers worry that the gap between the haves and the have-nots will only grow. History shows, however, that this need not be so. So let's look at the options. Emphasize that a particular view is overly negative. Associate the author with a specific school of economic thought. Convey the full urgency of a contemporary problem. Suggest the biases of a group of researchers. So this would be A, right? Because the word doomsayers indicates that people who hold this view think that it's all doom and destruction when it comes to skilled labor wages. But the author says that that view is not correct because history shows that apart from these two cases, there has been a consistent ratio of skilled to unskilled laborers, right? So the idea that there would be a decline, a precipitous decline in skilled labor wages, that is overly negative, right? That's what doomsayers indicates. This is not to associate the author with a particular school of economic thought. The discussion of the economics of these wages has not been introduced yet, so this is not B. It's in fact not a contemporary problem. The author is saying that we must not be too negative about prospects for wages. So it's not C. And this is general view of some people, right? It doesn't have to be a group of researchers. So A is the best answer. Which choice provides the best evidence for the idea that Clark's findings discussed in the second paragraph were part of a more widespread phenomenon? So what was Clark saying? So if you go back and look at the second paragraph, which is here. So the recent rise in earnings for skilled workers is a rare historical phenomenon, compiling records from churches, monasteries, colleges, guilds, and governments. So he basically showed that that ratio was consistent, right? And he focuses on England, right? Because his focus is on English wages. But then the author also talks about data from Jan Litton of Utrecht University showing that similar patterns could be found in Belgium, France, and Netherlands. So the idea that this was more widespread is in lines 36 to 39. So that should be my evidence. Yeah, so that's option B, lines 35 to 38. Let's just look at the other options. 20, the first and change. The first and change. So this is still talking about data in England. So this is not referring to the phenomenon being more widespread. 54 using results. 54 using and results. Okay, so this talks about a different inequality measure, which was employed by another University of California professor. So again, this doesn't show that the phenomenon that Clark studied was more widespread. And 64 to 67, what workers? What and workers. Okay, so this now talk about the present, right? How the present age is different in terms of showing an increase in the wages of skilled workers. So that also is not relevant to what Clark studied. Based on the passage, it can reasonably be concluded that there is a strong relationship between fluctuations in the skilled wage premium and fluctuations in the average number of years unskilled laborers who take on apprenticeships spend in completing them. Overall supply of industrial machines available for training apprentices, total number of workers in the labor force of a particular country in a particular time period, balance of skilled workers to unskilled workers as a percentage of a particular country's labor force. So this would be D, right? Because if you look back at the two times when the skilled wage premium dropped, that was the first was when interest rates started falling. And so there was an increased supply of skilled labor relative to unskilled workers, which is why the wage premium went down. And the second was when, because of industrial revolution, inventions like the power loom displaced artisans and increased the relative demand for unskilled labor. So in both cases, the balance shifted towards unskilled labor, which is what option D is saying, that as a percentage of the particular country's labor force, the balance shifted to unskilled labor, and that was how there was fluctuations in skilled wage premium. Okay, average number of years unskilled workers who take on apprenticeships. This is only relevant to the first case. This doesn't relate to the Industrial Revolution, so not A. Overall supply of industrial machines available for training apprentices. So this is not relevant at all because there was no mention of machines training apprentices, so it's not B. And total number of workers in the labor force, it's not the total number of workers, it's the relative numbers between skilled and unskilled. So D. As used in line 60, captured most nearly means. So let's look at line 60. This one. The share of earnings captured by the top 1% reached a high in around 1870. So what's the best replacement for this? Acquired, right? The share of earnings acquired by the top 1% of the population. So to capture the share of earnings is to acquire it. That's the best answer in context. Confined has a sense of limitation, so that doesn't fit the context of earnings. Found, you cannot say that the share of earnings was found by the top 1%, it was acquired, right? There is a sense of possession here. And apprehend is used to mean to understand, for example, to apprehend a theory, and that doesn't fit the context of earnings, so D. The passage most strongly suggests that major advances in technology are likely to result in an initial decrease in interest rates and wage premiums, a rise in wages for craftsmen and other skilled workers, an overall increase in jobs for both skilled and unskilled workers, a loss of jobs for certain types of skilled workers. So it's D, right? Because, and this is evidence-based. Yes. So because you know that when you have a major advance in technology, as you did after the Industrial Revolution, then there was a loss of jobs for artisans who were displaced by these machines, right? So let's try and find the evidence for that. Mr. Clark declines 13 and ratio 1960-50. So 13, Mr. Clark and declines, and 50 ratio and 1960. Okay. 67 so far workers, 76 in any market. 67 so far workers and in any market. Okay, so let's look at when we talk about technology having an effect. So Mr. Clark notes that in the past, the skilled wage premium was fairly stable. So this is just describing the historical context. It's not talking about technology particularly. Option B, the ratio of craftsman wages to laborers started to fall in the early 1800s and did not recover until 1960. So this talks about a trend, but does not give you the reasons for that trend. So not option B. So far, university degrees have been a reliable proxy for skill, but this may change as artificial intelligence starts taking jobs away from white-collar workers. So this is good evidence for how technology can upend the labor market. So I like C. In any case, to assume that current economic trends will persist is to assume an inefficient labor market. So this is looking at the problem from the efficiency of the labor market. So this is not relevant to technology. So I like C, right? And to go back to 37, it does result in a loss for certain types of skilled workers, as we saw with the artificial intelligence probably posing a threat to skilled workers. An initial decrease in interest rates and wage premiums. So when you have a major technology, you could see a decrease in wage premium, but interest rates was only relevant to the first example that Clark studied, so not A. A rise in wages for craftsmen? No. So it actually leads to a dip. So it's not B. And an overall increase in jobs for both skilled and unskilled workers. So again, it's not about increase in jobs for skilled. It might see an increase for unskilled workers. So D is the best answer. It can reasonably be inferred from the discussion of projections from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics that over time university degrees may become. So this is line 71 to 75, the part that we were just reading. That projections from America's Bureau of Labor Statistics show that 4 of the 5 fastest growing occupations in the country involve personal care. None of those jobs require a bachelor's degree. So what does that mean? University degrees may become weaker indicators of employability, easier to attain than they were prior to the computer age, stronger predictors of earning potential, less valuable for those who are not studying technology. So this is A, right? Because if artificial intelligence removes the need for skilled workers and jobs that will be the jobs of the future involve personal care, which does not require any advanced degrees, then university degrees will not be a good indicator of employability, right? Now, obviously, C is wrong because they would become weaker predictors of earning potential, not stronger. And B and D are just irrelevant because we are not talking about how easy they would be to attain or whether it pertains to studying technology. In which of the years listed in the graph was the craftsman wage greatest relative to the laborer wage? Okay, so this is craftsman wage and the greatest relative to the laborer's wage. Okay, so that would be this point. That's 1300, right? That's 200% of the laborer's wage. So 1300. Okay. According to the graph, the interval in which the craftsman wage remained within the narrowest range of values relative to the laborer wage was between 12 and 13, 13 and 14, 15 and 16, 18 and 19. Okay, so the craftsman wage remained in the narrowest range was between, I would say 15 and 16, right? Because 18 and 19, I do see a drop. 13 and 12 and 13, I do see an increase. 13 and 14, I do see a drop. So 15 and 16 is relatively stable. Yeah, C. Based on Clark's findings as described in the third paragraph, which is the most likely explanation for the data for 1200 to 1300 shown in the graph. So what was Clark saying for that period? Let's just go back and revisit it. Yeah, this one. So the first drop came in the 14th century and had nothing to do with technological change. Life expectancy in medieval England was short and interest rates were high, meaning that taking on the 7-year apprenticeship needed to become a craftsman came with a heavy opportunity cost. But interest rates started falling in this period from around 10% to 7.5%. And then there was the Black Death, which led to a complete fall in interest rates. And there was therefore a glut in the supply of skilled workers, right? And so this is the Black Death that is being shown. And the question pertains to 1200 to 1300, right? So that is, you do see from 1200 to 300, you see a great increase. But I don't think Clark talks about that period. He talks about the period after 1300. So let's just look at that. Life expectancy rose, so more workers became apprentices, which increased the supply of skilled workers. Interest rates rose, so fewer workers became apprenticeships, which decreased the supply of skilled workers. Cities were growing at a rapid rate, which resulted in projects that increased the demand for unskilled workers. New inventions were automating complex tasks, which decreased the demand for skilled workers. So it's B, right? Because in the period from 1200 to 1300, interest rates rose. And so, because that was costly to become an apprentice, fewer workers became apprentices. And so the supply of skilled workers, of craftsmen, was consistent, which led to an increase in their wages. But it was towards the end of the 13th century, around 1290, when they started declining, and they fell precipitously after Black Death, which is why there was a decline between 1300 and 1400. So life expectancy or growth of cities or new inventions, none of that is brought out in Clark's analysis of this period. So B. Okay, so let's create this. 32. B, A, B, triple D. B, A, B, D, D, D. And C, double A, C, B. C, A, A, C, B. Okay, great. So we got all correct.